You think, oh, stays, they're meant for like squishing you in, but also they're incredibly supportive. More supportive than some of the people I've dated. I don't know if that says more about stays or, well, we'll just leave it at that. Hello, welcome back. As you would have been able to tell before I had the cat on me, today we are making stays, following the 8162 simplicity pattern made in association with American Duchess. I'm not gonna lie, it took me a very long time to make this garment because, well, I was afeared. They seem incredibly intimidating, although they are an important structural garment, so realistically I should have made them after making the chemise. But instead I put it off until after I made all of the outer garments, and then a little bit longer because I was afeared. But now that I've actually tackled making the stays, they're not as bad as I thought, and surprisingly comfortable. And the best part is they give you the ideal 18th century body shape, which is an ice cream cone. And what do I mean by that? Conical on the bottom with a couple of scoops on top. Well, I mean, for normal people. I am flat as a board, so this does nothing in the chest region for me. But it does provide some great back support, which we are always here for. So come along on this journey of stay making. We'll be staying right here. The materials for this project were 2 used pillowcases and a bolt of mystery fabric that I got for $5 from the thrift store. I started by cutting out the pieces, and then my project was promptly commandeered by my cat, who was staging a sit-in because I made him a ruff in the last episode. Next, I transferred the markings from the pattern onto the fabric so that I would know exactly where I needed to place my eyelet holes and have my seams. Let's mock this up. I made Julian relive some of his past rough glory or trauma, perhaps. With my fashion fabric cut, it was time to assemble these Avengers. I basted the inner lining layers to the outer fashion fabric, so all of it would stay together as I sewed in the boning channels by machine. So basically the plan is to draw 5/8 inch seam allowance here and here, and then to fully bone, I do a little over 1/4 inch on this ruler. So I go 3 marks, 3/8 of an inch, and I'm gonna start following each line until they meet. And there's gotta be an insertion point either at the top or the bottom for each of the lines I draw. So that's what I gotta keep in mind as I go to fully bone these. And I think I realized last time that I should not be sewing all the way up here because this is seam allowance as well. So I decided to fully bone these stays. I watched American Duchess's tutorial on how to do it, and naturally got one of these bad boys because once you get a quilting ruler, suddenly your stays will make themselves. I started by doing my seam allowances, and then I worked inward from the seam allowances, met in the middle, and tried to do boning in the tabs. So I do have a little dead spot here, which will be unboned. And this is my first one, so I've got a whole cat's worth to do. Excuse me, sir. Sir. So I'm just doing a little double check because I know there's some things that I don't want to miss, like tabs and like spacing for eyelets on some of the front pieces. I'm going to make it front lacing only. I don't have to worry about doing the back because I need to make it smaller and I don't want to do as many eyelets, so killing 2 birds with 1 stone. We're not killing any birds. We are gently moving birds out of a bush with 1 hand. Channel sewing time. So then I spent approximately 500 years of my life sewing boning channels into these stays. I mean, once you get into the swing of things, it is kind of mesmerizing to a certain extent, but also you better have a good audiobook because it's going to take a while. Once I sewed in all the channels, I was able to seam rip out all the basting stitches, and then I pinned everything together to get a rough estimate of what the fit would be once it's sewn. So along here, and here, so along here as well. And also have to attach the straps and then press all the seams open. After my 500 years of solitude on the boning channels, the step of cutting the tabs was especially terrifying. In retrospect, at this stage, I probably should have cut the tabs a little bit higher to fit over my waist a bit better, but it works well enough as is. Next, I pinned everything together and I sewed along all of the seam allowances to connect the pieces together into one happy stay. Stays? Stay with me.
Ooh, she pretty.
In my quest to become a better seamstress, I actually pressed open the seams to prepare them for whipping down. I also tried the stays on using some pins to close them at the front. Found that the fit was pretty good, although I would need to make it smaller so that I couldn't close it entirely. Tried my best fashion modeling skills.
In the zip tie bones, I took in these front seams and the center back seam a little bit. These front pieces were overlapping before. I need this to be able to pull together tighter to support everything, so I may still need to take it in on the side seams a little bit more, or fold this under where the eyelets go. I'm not exactly sure. I need to look at the pattern. I'm starting to put in boning just to size it.
I did end up taking in the side seams on the front pieces as well as the center back seam, and then I went straight to boning. I went with the deeply classy nail clipper method to shorten my zip tie boning. It would feel untoward if I didn't insert a boning joke here. I'll let you guess whether or not I actually filed down any of the edges.
This is the front. I'm going to fold this over, sew it down to make a boning channel, and then the eyelets are going to go in here. So on the front, the eyelets will be in this channel here.
I marked the placement of the eyelets on the fashion fabric, and then instead of going the meat thermometer route, I figured out that you can also use a tapestry needle to puncture a hole, and then just shove an entire knitting needle through, in lieu of using an actual awl. So there's a tip for all of you who are awlless. I spent a good 20 to 30 minutes sewing eyelet holes completely incorrectly, and then realized my mistake, did a bit of Googling, and by the time of this video capture, I actually knew what I was doing. I tried the stays on and was really excited with the fit.
I stitched around the outside of all of the tabs and the top, and now I'm going to trim off so I can whip that stuff down.
With the haircut finished, it was time to whip it real good. So I whip stitched all of the loose seam allowance down. Then for approximately a 2-week period, I wore the stays almost every day as I worked at my desk, but put off tackling bias binding as long as humanly possible, because I was afeared. So that may have some cleavage. Not really. And yes, the stays are officially approved for business. With no excuses left, I carelessly delved into the breech and pinned on some bias tape in a very wonky manner. This is not Julian approved. I spent a couple hours stitching it on. I used the width of bias binding that they suggested on the pattern, but in the end, I thought it was way too bright and way too thick. Julian agreed. So I decided to dye it with some green Brit dye I had on hand. Realistically, I should have done the dye by the book, you know, filled up a pot, mixed up the dye, put it in, and then dyed my binding. Instead, I just threw the dye and the binding in the pot at the exact same time, so now there's random splotches of red and blue instead of green. But done is better than perfect, so I took my splotchy bias binding, cut it in half, and then sewed it on to my stays. This time around, I had a little bit more practice since I had done the botched attempt already, so I took my stays camping with me and spent some lovely hours in the sunshine sewing and whipping that bias binding on. I was excited to model my stays with some artwork my mom had made out of makeup, nail polish, and one bug. Even though there's a number of technical things that I really should fix with these stays or change in future versions, overall I'm quite pleased with the result, especially for a first time out. And honestly, I'm just so pleased that I'm finally the 18th century ice cream cone I was always meant to be. Thanks so much for cuddling up with us and watching this stays video. If you enjoyed this and like things like historical sewing, cats, or just general shenanigans, go ahead and subscribe because there's plenty more where that came from. And yes, I will be doing a video soon looking into whether or not stays can help with back pain if you sit at the computer like an absolute gremlin. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you'll come back, and in the meantime, keep making. My cat is wearing the Jacobean ruff I made him and laying on the stays that I'm making next to the Shakespeare coloring book that I also made, so that's how quarantine's going for me.